Good evening. It is often said that in desperate times, technocrats do not become imaginative. They merely become reckless. We are currently witnessing a profound manifestation of this recklessness in the corridors of Brussels and Washington, a spectacle of geopolitical self-harm masquerading as clever financial statecraft. I am speaking, of course, about the recent much-lauded decision by the G7 and the European Union to utilize the frozen assets of the Russian Federation to fund the ongoing war effort in Ukraine. On the surface, to the average observer consuming mainstream Western media, this appears to be a stroke of retributive justice. Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia has hundreds of billions sitting idle in Western financial plumbing. Therefore, use that money to make Russia pay for its own containment. It sounds simple, it sounds morally satisfying, yet as an economist who has spent years battling the catastrophic short-sightedness of the European establishment, I must tell you that what is being presented as a financial triumph is in reality a historical trap, one that Europe has walked into with its eyes wide shut, driven by a combination of desperation, hubris, and a terrifying lack of strategic autonomy. We need to understand the mechanics of this situation beyond the headlines. Following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Western nations froze approximately $300 billion of Russian central bank assets. The vast majority of this, nearly 200 billion euros, is sitting in Belgium, managed by the clearinghouse Euroclear. For 2 years, a fierce debate raged behind closed doors. The ultra-legislators in Washington and some hawkish voices in Eastern Europe demanded full confiscation, simply seizing the capital principal and handing it to Kyiv. However, the adults in the room, specifically the central bankers, including the European Central Bank and major EU powers like Germany and France, balked at this, because they knew that arbitrarily confiscating sovereign state assets would be the definitive end of the international financial order built over the last 70 years. It would broadcast to the world, to China, to Saudi Arabia, to Brazil, that your reserves are safe in euros or dollars only, so long as you entirely align with Washington's foreign policy du jour. Christine Lagarde herself warned that such moves could break the legal order that sustains the euro. So, unable to seize the capital without detonating their own financial system, the European technocrats devised a clever workaround, a piece of legal sophistry designed to bypass international law while achieving the same optical result. They decided they would not seize the assets themselves, but rather the windfall profits generated by those assets. These billions of euros are not just sitting in a vault, they are maturing bonds generating interest. Because they are frozen, Russia cannot collect the interest. So Euroclear is sitting on a massive pile of cash generated by this interest, estimated at around $3 billion to $5 billion annually. The great G7 breakthrough in Italy this June was the decision to use this interest stream as collateral to back a $50 billion loan to Ukraine. They argue this is legally distinct from seizing the property itself. It is the financial equivalent of saying, I am not stealing your house, I am simply renting it out against your will and keeping the income to fund your enemies. This brings us to the nature of the trap. The first jaw of the trap is the message this sends to the global south. We are already living in an era of accelerating fragmentation. The BRICS nations are actively seeking alternatives to the dollar-based trading system precisely because they fear the weaponization of finance that the US has perfected over the last 2 decades. By crossing this Rubicon, by politicizing the very plumbing of the global financial system, the clearinghouses themselves, Europe has confirmed the worst fears of the non-Western world. Do you honestly believe that the Saudis currently pondering whether to price oil in petro-yuan are looking at the seizure of Russian interest payments and thinking, yes, Europe is a safe, neutral harbor for my capital? Of course not. They are accelerating their diversification away from the euro and the dollar. This is not an overnight collapse. Finance does not work like that. It is a slow, corrosive process of de-risking. Central banks began buying gold at record rates in 2022 and 2023 specifically to insulate themselves from this kind of Western Europe, which relies entirely on its reputation as a rule of law zone to attract capital to finance its deficits, is lighting that reputation on fire for a short-term cash injection that will barely cover a few months of the Ukrainian budget deficit. Before we examine the retaliatory aspects of this dynamic, if you find these analyses of our unfolding economic reality useful, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel and comment below letting me know which city and country you are watching from. It helps broaden the reach of these discussions. Now, consider the second jaw of the trap, the Russian response. It is a profound mistake, one frequently made by Western liberals, to assume that Vladimir Putin and the technocrats running the Russian central bank, like Elvira Nabiullina, are incompetent. They are ruthless, yes, but they are not fools. They anticipated this move. For over a year, the Kremlin has been preparing its countermeasures. While the West focuses on the frozen state assets abroad, they conveniently forget the massive amounts of Western private assets trapped inside Russia. These are the so-called Type C accounts. When Western corporations pulled out of Russia in the theatrical exodus of 2022, many left behind billions in physical infrastructure, factories, retail spaces, and financial holdings that they could not liquidate or repatriate due to Moscow's capital controls. Russia has effectively frozen these assets in retaliation. The Kremlin has explicitly stated that any action taken against their sovereign assets in Europe will be met with symmetrical or perhaps asymmetrical responses against Western property in Russia. We have already seen dry runs of this. We saw the seizure of assets belonging to shadowy entities or underperforming Western firms, handed over to domestic management. But the real leverage lies in the holdings of major European banks and energy companies still tied up in the Russian Federation. If Brussels begins siphoning off billions in interest from Euroclear, Moscow will simply begin confiscating equivalent amounts from Western corporate balance sheets trapped within their borders. The difference is crucial. Europe is attacking sovereign reserves, undermining faith in its state-level financial architecture. Russia will be attacking private Western capital, directly hurting the balance sheets of major European corporations that are already struggling with high energy costs and deindustrialization. It is a game of financial chicken where Europe's financial reputation is the car, and Russia's is already a tank that has been written off by Western insurance company. Europe has infinitely more to lose in a war of financial attrition against a state that has already been severed from the Western system. Furthermore, we must look at the context of why this is happening now, why this desperate grasp for Russian cash, because the previous strategy has failed. We must be honest. 12, 13, 14 rounds of sanctions were promised to crush the Russian economy, to reduce the ruble to rubble, to cause imminent collapse. Instead, the IMF recently upgraded Russia's growth forecast, expecting it to grow faster than all advanced economies, including the United States, and certainly faster than the stagnant Eurozone. The sanctions fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the Russian economy, which is a resource autark. By cutting them off from the West, we forced them to reorient their entire supply chain eastward towards China, India, and Turkey, accelerating the very multipolarity Western leaders claim to fear. The Russian war machine is now humming on a hybridized Keynesian military stimulus. Meanwhile, Europe is experiencing the opposite. The severing of cheap Russian energy inputs has caused a permanent competitiveness shock to German industry, the engine of Europe. We are seeing deindustrialization in real time. The European populace is suffering from a cost of living crisis directly attributable to these geopolitical choices. The political center is collapsing across the continent, as seen in recent European elections, because establishment parties demand citizens sacrifice their living standards for a proxy war that has no discernible endgame. In this context, European leaders are terrified of going back to their own taxpayers and asking for another $50 billion for Ukraine. The political capital is gone, so they must find the money elsewhere. The frozen Russian assets seem like a free lunch, a way to fund the war without angering their own voters further. But there is no free lunch in geopolitics. The price they are paying is the long-term viability of the euro as a global reserve currency. The ultimate irony is that this move does not even solve Ukraine's problems. The $50 billion loan package secured by these illicit Russian profits is a stopgap. It will keep the Ukrainian state on life support through the next American election cycle, which is the real objective. of the Biden administration, but it does not change the military reality on the ground, which is deeply unfavorable to Kyiv. It does not rebuild the shattered energy infrastructure. It merely prolongs a devastating stalemate while transferring the long-term costs onto the shoulders of European financial stability. Europe has walked into a trap because it lacks the sovereignty to act in its own interest. It is following a script written in Washington, a script that views Europe not as a partner, but as a vassal to be utilized in a grand strategy against Eurasia. The US suffers little from the weaponization of Euroclear. The dollar's dominance is far more entrenched than the euro. It is Europe that will bear the brunt of the retaliation and the long-term reputational damage. We are sacrificing the foundational principles of our economic system: property rights, legal certainty, neutrality of financial infrastructure, in a desperate, ineffective attempt to patch over the failures of our geopolitical strategy. They are watching Europe dismantle its own greatest asset, its reputation for financial stability, and they are preparing to exact a heavy price on the Western companies unfortunate enough to still have exposure to their market. This is not statecraft. It is an act of slow-motion self-immolation by a continental elite that has lost its grip on reality. Please note that this channel is not official and is not affiliated with Yanis Varoufakis. This content is a simulation of his analytical style and political perspective.